So I promised you, how could you save your life? How can you save lives? This is what I think you want to worry about. Clocks, cadence, and cats. Now, really, that's going to make sense, I promise. So let's talk about clocks first. How can you save your life? When it comes to shootings, remember that 70% of the shootings that the FBI researched, 70% of them end in 5 minutes or less. So how long do you need to keep yourself safe? Most of the time, 5 minutes. 35% of those, 2 minutes or less. You need a couple of minutes to be smarter and faster than your shooter. That's what you need to save your life. When law enforcement engages the shooter, nearly 50% of the time, law enforcement is in a firefight and suffers casualties. But generally, law enforcement doesn't get there. Only 15% of the time does law enforcement make it there before the shooting ends. And in those time periods, 13% we found in our initial research, 13% unarmed civilians selflessly and successfully stopped a shooter, an armed shooter. So don't think you can't do it, because when your life depends on it, it does. Here's another thing about clocks you should know. Though law enforcement is very good at this, and they might show up in a minute or 2 minutes, if you are an injured person or you're with an injured person, it's going to take about 15 minutes to get treatment, to initial treatment to somebody, and another half an hour before we start transporting them from a first responder standpoint. So oftentimes you'll hear about law enforcement throwing somebody in a car. That's been done. We know it was done at Aurora, Colorado. 18 people transported by police, 17 transported by fire and ambulance. All 18, the most severely wounded at Aurora Theater, survived because they were thrown in police cars. That was a protocol change. No one had ever done that before. You should hear the 911 tapes. You should hear the tapes between the police officers talking and this officer saying, I got to get these guys out of here, and Daly saying, get them in the car, throw them in the car, get them out of here. That was against police protocol, but they changed. Now police has changed their protocol, and if they need to throw somebody in a car, they do, because it just takes time to transport. It just makes a difference. You might not want to talk about run, hide, fight. You might not be supportive of it. I would love to dissuade you of that view. I would love to convince you. I dedicated 10 of 14 chapters in my book to prevention, and one entire chapter is on training children. I don't think there are plenty of books available to talk to kids, plenty of ways to train kids, just like we train them for fires and tornadoes. We train them in the idea that it's unlikely. When you move, everybody's emergency response is flight or fright, right? You freeze or you run away. We need you to do the running away part first, because we've seen, and I'm telling you this because I've seen so many CCTV coverage. I've looked at the cameras of shootings. I've seen some horrific situations on film that I would never want to ever tell you about before. Have any of you ever see? But in many cases, people freeze. And when you train to the simple concept of please either run, hide, or fight, or as they say in the UK, run, hide, and tell, or in some places, run, hide, and defend, if you understand that the first thing you need to do is run or hide, then you're going to save your life, and you're going to save the lives of people around you. So I told you that cats was important, and I wanted to just tell you cats is important, although this is a cute face, because of this. Copycat killers. This is something that I want to just ask you very briefly. I'm just going to briefly speak about this because I want to take questions. Because as I said, I'm excited to be here because you are the answers, but I have been researching this as an FBI agent, as a writer. I worked it as an FBI investigator. You know, that was all out in my world in Washington, D.C. Now I have a chance to talk to the people who actually can stop the shootings, can stop the killings, and I want to hear from you about what you think and what I'm missing. But copycat killing, we know, does occur. So I mentioned before about the Sandy Hook shooter. This is some of the research. I'm just going to flip through it real quick because I want to give us time and I want to get the yank off the stage. But remember that research we now know shows that in the 13 days after a mass shooting, or in another study, 4 to 10 days after a mass shooting, this Old Dominion University study with Western Australia, in the 4 to 10 days after a shooting, shootings increase by as many as 3 additional shootings. And particularly the Old Dominion study is frightening because this is one of the things that they said. Using our benchmark estimations, a simple back-of-the-envelope calculation suggests that 55% of all mass shootings in the time period they studied are explainable by news coverage. So news coverage, meaning traditional news coverage, I want to distinguish just this one point. I'm going to skip this slide because we don't have time. This is two agencies who told me why they use shooters' names and why they don't. Why they cover it and why they don't. One of the reasons that I just wanted to bring this point up is social media is challenging the work of traditional news media, because in social media accounts, when you have a shooting in your area, how many of you, don't raise your hand, how many of you on Twitter, well you can if you want, have put a marker in there and said, how come nobody's talking about this shooting? Well, that's because the media is aware of this research, and the media is trying to tamp down their coverage so less material, traditional news media, is trying to tamp down the extent of their coverage, shooting pictures, the shooter's guns and everything. They're trying to tamp that down as an organization because they want to minimize the way that the coverage gets pushed up onto the Sandy Hook shooter's walls and things like that. So the quandary is, don't be part of the story for the shooter by constantly talking about them on social media, because that is exactly what they want. That's what they want. So don't give them that. Do that for us, right? So here's the thing that I want to just close with this, and then I'll take questions. Don't talk about the shooters on social media. Please educate your kids and yourself in safety training. It's so simple. See those around you. Are they suicidal? They could be on their way to being a mass murderer. If you see something, please say something, and trust the fact that law enforcement, threat assessment teams, school counselors, your pastor, your cleric is going to do something about it. Say something to somebody else. Don't carry that burden on your shoulder. I have been at people's doors after a horrible situation where they have said, I knew something was up. And I just think, how does that person sleep at night? I just feel so bad for them. So trust your spidey senses, and please be kind. Please be kind, because that is just the easiest thing.